Okay, welcome. Everybody knows, that we have a major capacity crunch and it's impacting all modes, truck, rail, parcel, air, ocean. We've all heard about the driver shortage, the shortage of equipment and containers, the bottlenecks and problems that are impacting our supply chains. When we planned this workshop, we decided not to dwell on the causes of the crunch or to complain about the problems, but to focus on the possible solutions and what smart and creative people are actually doing about it to get the freight moving. Our moderator today is my good friend, Bill Cassidy, senior editor of the Journal of Commerce. Bill has been an annual participant in the council's annual conferences and our kickoff sessions on the state and future of the industry for many years. Even though his title is senior editor, he wears other hats as a reporter, journalist, writer, speaker on just about everything in domestic and international transportation. Without further ado, I'll turn the mic over to Bill and our five-star panel of experts. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. Thanks to TLC for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. My job today is to moderate this discussion and to give you a bit of an overview on, again, not to go into all the details about the causes of the current capacity crisis, but a bit of background or perspective from the Journal of Commerce and a bit of background on what Washington, D.C. can or cannot do about this. But before we get to that and get to our in-depth discussion, I want to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves briefly, tell us a bit about themselves and a bit about what makes their roles and their companies important in developing insight into the capacity issue. I'm going to start with Jared Slaughter.
Hello, my name is Jared Slaughter. I have 25 years of experience in logistics management, including over 2 years at Keen Footwear as the Director of Global Logistics. My primary responsibilities include procurement, international and domestic transportation, and logistics operations. For today's program, I'm going to focus on the mode of ocean from a shipper's perspective, including insights. Now I'll turn it to Christy.
Thank you, Jared, and thank you, TLC, for having me today. I'm Christy Knischel, President and CEO of Knischel Logistics. I have been in the industry for 24 years. My company is a 3PL and our niche is intermodal. We do have a truck brokerage and LTL service offerings as well, but I will be talking about the intermodal side of the business and what we're doing to try to find capacity and different options for our customers, and also things for shippers to be looking out for to be able to get capacity in this market. I'll turn it over to Scott Drozdowski.
All right, thanks, Christy. So good morning or good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Scott Drozdowski. I'm a Senior Manager, Carrier Development with GEODIS Logistics, based right outside of Nashville at our U.S. headquarters. I've been with GEODIS for going on 10 years, and I've been in the supply chain for actually going on 20. So today's program, my comments will be focused on the perspective from the 3PL and more specifically from LTL. And now I'll pass it on to Aaron.
You're muted, Aaron.
Don't you love it when you do that? Thank you for letting me know. Hi, I'm Aaron Schmidt. I am a Regional Vice President of Operations for NFI Industries. NFI is a leading 3PL in North America. I've been in the industry for 21 years in various roles of leadership, sales, operations, primarily on the non-asset side of the business, but I do work for a large asset-based trucking company in NFI. So today, my comments will be focused around the asset-based trucking side of the business. Not necessarily reflective of NFI, but as an industry as a whole. And back to you, Bill.
Well, thanks, Aaron. Well, there's obviously a lot to cover here. I forgot to mention that in my own background, I've been with the Journal of Commerce for 25 years this year. been covering trucking and transportation since, I hate to say it, 1984. So I've seen a lot in that period, from the very early days of deregulation right through, the explosion of international traffic, the growth of 3PLs, and leading us to where we are today. I have never seen, though, as almost everybody I've talked to this year so far has told me, a capacity crisis quite like this one, both in terms of its extent, in terms of its length, and in terms of how long it might last into the future. We are in, as I think you'll hear, and you probably have heard already, unprecedented territory. There are a lot of factors that are feeding into this. I want to share just 3 charts with you that give you some perspective on how I see the capacity crisis driving things today. So bear with me while I share my screen and very quickly get to this chart. So this chart shows US retail sales outstripping inventories. We're looking at sales and inventories in millions of dollars, as charted by the US Census Bureau. And what's fascinating here, this really shows us how demand is driving this crisis. I think even more than, any temporary or short-term absence of drivers, equipment, or delays being caused by, as we'll see, ships that are berthed that are anchored off our coast rather than berthed. But you can see here at the very end of the chart, sales have recovered, from the Great Recession and are rising to heights we haven't seen before. Inventories, the gray line at the top, plummeted, but then recovered a bit and now look to be declining. And so we have earlier this year, for the first time here.
Bill, your chart is not showing. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, I am sorry. I'm glad you pointed that out. The wonders of technology. Can you see my screen at all?
No.
All right, let me come back to here.
Worked perfect earlier, huh?
It did, it always works fine the first time you're trying it. And then when you try and do it again to replicate it, not so much. Okay, so how is this?
There we go.
There we go. Okay. So my apologies, but you can see from this chart, sales overtaking inventories. Inventories coming down, but the question there is, a lot of the decline represents automotive vehicles and parts. If you strip out automotive vehicles and parts, which represent about 20% of truckload freight, you would see inventories overall are still climbing. But even though inventories are climbing, sales are climbing even faster, which means inventory to sales ratios are being pushed down to new lows. And that means we're seeing faster turns on inventory, more demand for replenishment, more demand for freight hauling services, whether it's ocean containers, rail intermodal, or trucks. So, demand is really pushing this crisis forward at a level that it is very hard for, I think, the assets or the personnel to overtake. This chart looks at the number of vessels at anchor and the number of vessels berthed at our largest port complex, LA Long Beach. And you can see here that, we were up, in the 30s, vessels anchored offshore, waiting to get into port back in February, causing enormous delays. That number came down. The number of vessels berthed has been more or less constant. It's not a straight line, but it's a pretty even motion across that chart from February right through, this month. But you do see after June, hitting a low point, the number of vessels anchored waiting to get in is rising again, as we see unprecedented levels of inventory, of goods, imported goods in containers coming into LA Long Beach. and other US ports too. So, the Global Port Tracker, the National Retail Federation see this continuing into the fall. We're not seeing any relief from that big wave of imports, which is only part of the story about capacity, but it's there. But I think the important thing I want to mention here, when you see that number get that high of ships waiting to get into the port, what that's telling us is we're having delays in unloading containers. We're having delays in loading containers onto intermodal rail or transloading them into truck. We're having delays in Chicago. We're having delays at inland distribution centers, and shelves are not being stocked. We're hearing, shippers have told us, they're facing delays 3 to 4 weeks to get goods to market. And that's a lot of time, in this market when demand is this high. So what happens at the ports affects everything. And this last slide I want to share with you is a little index we put together to try and track trends in trucking employment, at least as far as company employees go. So this chart looks at the truck transportation employment numbers put out monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and indexes them to the 2018 fourth quarter average. We had an older version of this, which was indexed to 2006, which showed the growth in employment after the Great Recession. Doesn't really mean so much after this past recession and the pandemic. But looking back to 2018, you can see that we peaked in 2019 in terms of for-hire trucking company payroll employment. And while we've bounced back, we still have quite a ways to go to recover that pre-pandemic high. What this doesn't show you is that there have been 58,000 new active motor carriers entering the industry this year alone, since January. Most of those companies are really small, 1 to 6 trucks, and most of them probably are S corporations. They're self-employed drivers, or maybe one owner operator shares the authority with 5 other drivers. So they're not showing up in these numbers. That's about 157,000 drivers overall, according to FTR Transportation Intelligence. So a lot of drivers are out there that don't show up in the BLS numbers. It's getting harder and harder to come to a judgment as to where these drivers are. But if they are indeed at these small carriers, that makes it difficult if you're a large shipper to tap into that capacity. And it's making it even harder for large carriers to hire drivers because they're going to these smaller companies instead. And I'm sure that Aaron and others will have some views on that. So to stop sharing the screen there and just go back to a brief discussion, I wanted to talk to you briefly about what Washington can and cannot do to affect the crisis that we're going through. From my perspective, there are some things they can do, but they probably are small, and Washington moves relatively slowly, as we have come to understand. So they're not going to necessarily affect what you see this year. But there were 3 or 4 things that came to mind. Some are positive, some are negative. One of the negatives, which is also a positive, is the Federal Drug and Alcohol Test Clearinghouse set up by the FMCSA. That's been in operation for about a year now. And we have seen somewhere between 45,000 and 60,000 drivers, depending on who I talk to, drop out of the pool because they have been shown to have had violations in other states. So they can no longer go back and just move from state to state, not informing their new employer about the drug tests they failed or the violations they had in a previous state. Not many of those drivers who have been blacklisted more or less are doing much to get their jobs back. I mean, there is a remediation process they can go through. Most of them have not entered into that. So those are, between 30,000 and 60,000 drivers who have effectively left the pool for long haul transportation. That's not a huge number compared to the overall number, but it is a small percentage, but significant, especially in a market like this. Another thing, we have seen positively during the pandemic, there were a lot of emergency exemptions to hours of service rules. Some of those are still in place, actually. That's a positive thing. Could hours of service rules be changed in order to provide drivers with more flexibility? The industry has seen lots of waves of activity, depending on almost every administration has done something in the past 20 years. I don't think people are looking for a lot from there right now. There's some things that maybe could help, but again, that's not likely due to the process involved to be of any help very soon. Third thing, rising insurance requirements. In the infrastructure bill that's currently being debated, there is an amendment which would raise the minimum insurance levels carriers must have. That obviously for smaller carriers is going to be an issue, although larger carriers will argue that it's something that is necessary. Could that affect capacity down the road if it gets passed, if it's part of this bill when it goes for a final vote? Possibly, but again, I think that is going to be something that we'll look at more next year than this year. Unemployment benefits, certainly we've seen unemployment benefits be extended, additional unemployment benefits offered through the CARES Act and other legislation. I've often heard executives tell me that this is a major issue, that it's keeping people from returning to work. I've also seen results of studies that have said it's not a major issue unless your pay is somewhere under $30,000 a year. So it's a big issue perhaps for those who are trying to hire warehouse and dock workers who are working on a lower end wage scale. Is it really a problem for truck drivers? I mean, I would hope not. I would hope that the pay scale has improved to the point where, and especially you have to say, if you can go out on the spot market today with the rates that are out there now, you want to do it. You don't want to sit around if you can make the kind of money that's available today. But this is something that comes up a lot in conversations. Maybe we'll see this fall some results of the rollback in certain states or the end of the overall benefits. I don't think to this date, even though some states have already rolled them back, there's no hard evidence that it's had a real impact on the trucking employment side. And one last thing I will mention before I pass it on and we go on to discuss some of the steps that shippers can take to help alleviate these problems. The reclassification of drivers, this has come up a lot, especially in California, where a number of legal cases have led to the state changing the rules under which you determine whether a worker is an employee or a contractor. I mean, this has been going on for a long time. It is gaining steam in certain areas. Certainly TLC has heard from people talking about this. Will it really affect capacity? I think if it does, it's going to take quite a while. It's not, again, something that's going to overnight change the marketplace. However, I think what's more likely to happen with the classification issue, if classification guidelines for employees change significantly, I think what we'll see happen is we'll see carriers who use owner-operators change the way they use those owner-operators first. We've seen this happen already in the past with FedEx, where FedEx Ground used to contract with individual drivers, and after multiple lawsuits and losses in court, they changed the way they contract. They now contract with agents who hire those drivers or contract with those drivers. So I think we'll see a change in operating model that may or may not change the capacity that's out there. I think the biggest issue for the capacity that's out there, again, if you're looking at trucking in particular, it's where those drivers are. And if I were a larger shipper who was having difficulty getting access to truck capacity from my primary carriers, how do I bring more carriers into the mix? How do I bring smaller carriers? Of all these smaller carriers are out there now, 58,000 new carriers this year, most of them with fewer than 100 trucks. How do I access them? Do I go through intermediaries? Are there other things I can do with technology? Are there new digital platforms developing? Those are all good questions we can discuss going forward. But with that, I'm going to wrap and hand this over to Jared to talk about ocean capacity.
Thank you, Bill. It's impressive to go after Bill Cassidy. Wow. Known Bill for a long time, Journal of Commerce. He's quite the expert. I'm happy to be here with all these heavy hitters that we have on this workshop. Bill makes some really good points, especially when we talk about inventory and sales. So what I'm going to do today is talk about the mode of ocean, but I'm going to use it look at it from a lens of a shipper's perspective. And today, I'm representing my personal insights and overviews. And so I want to share these. I'm sure the time that I was given is about 10 minutes, and I could go on for an hour and a half on this subject because I'm passionate about logistics. But I'm going to go ahead and roll into it. And when we look at Bill's slide that he had earlier, we must, as shippers, think about what true north is. What I'm talking about on true north is, as a logistics professional, we're here to protect our supply chains. So when I'm making logistics decisions or planning it, or my team's engaged and working with our internal customers and external customers, the number one thing we think about is true north. And that is, we're here to protect keen supply chain. We can't lose sight of what our key objective is. And what I mean by that is we go back and we look back into the springtime, and we had already experienced a very challenging Q4, Chinese New Year. One of the key things that we were up against is capacity. How do we find capacity in the ocean market to be able to move our footwear, right? So as we entered the ocean negotiations, which typically happens in springtime and close in May, of course, we attended the TPM information. We were reading Journal of Commerce. We were reaching out to our partners, other shippers. And our plan and strategy was about capacity is king, meaning it's the number one thing during our bid in evaluating our suppliers, under BCO agreements, beneficial cargo owner or NVO. Our priority is capacity. And when we went and negotiated the agreements, that was our number one thing that we targeted. But also, I want to say we're in unprecedented times. So as things as we may have as shippers excluded in agreements, or just basically said flat no, or trying to only focus a bid on rates, we really had to read the market. And I really want to stress on that as a shipper. You should do that every year, but especially when you're in a market that's unprecedented, is reevaluate what's important and what you're trying to achieve. In addition to the ocean market, when we did the bids, I know there was a lot of stress, a lot of discussion about diversifying your network, meaning that seek out new partners, leverage the ones that are supporting and helping move your brand's footwear, and build a good bench strength of providers. That's always important in any mode, but especially in this unprecedented situation that we're in. So then moving forward, as the contract season completed, and some of the operational things that we're doing and other shippers are doing, is old processes. I've been in logistics for over 25 plus years, including Fortune 500 company. Old processes may not apply. Be flexible, be open to new ideas. As Bill said, unprecedented times, and I keep resounding that myself, we must be, things that may have worked may not work today. And I know Christy, when she talks about in her presentation, she's going to talk about some additional things that are really interesting. And I would say with my team and also leveraging our partners, we're always open to these ideas. Additional thing that I would add is engage with experts. So this would include your 3PLs that you use today, includes your network of shippers and trade publications such as the Journal of Commerce. Dig deep. When you have access to experts, really dig into some of the foundational things that they're thinking about that are new, or some things that may be of old that are currently working, and reevaluate them. Have an open mind. So I would kind of look at it at this lens is discovery and evaluate. And things that I can add that my team and myself have leveraged through this is we've identified origin alternative port routings, including inland trucking, cross-border in Asia, and also intra-Asia feeders that in my past experience, those are things that were rarely done, and we really focus on optimization. Now we must focus on protecting the brand and protecting our supply chains. Also looking at alternative destination ports. You may have your DC at a certain location and you typically use only one port of entry, or maybe you have some diversification and use two. But look at all options that are on the table to protect your supply chain and continue to move the goods. And if you're not doing transload operations, you may also look at ad hoc transload operations at alternative ports of entry to keep your supply chain moving. The next is relationships. I can't stress enough in logistics that people do make a difference. Honestly, it's just, going through this and seeking out those account managers that are just awesome people and building the relationships and trust with them, giving them a line of sight of what's important to you as a shipper. And making sure that when you have these relationships that you're leveraging them and also getting access to other experts within that company. There's been so many times that we've been able to talk to origin experts and understanding what is actually the feet on the ground, what are you hearing, and what alternatives are there? Not to say that there's always some secret magic potion, because they're not, but if you understand what are some of the options and you keep evaluating, you may find yourself some good solutions that help protect your supply chain. And one example I can give on this is years ago that forecasting. I know there's been a lot of talk about ocean forecasting. I implemented ocean forecasting over 12 years ago, and we keep hearing this under our BCO agreements and under our NVO, which is a freight forwarder agreements as well, and understanding how that helps. So the open dialogue of asking your carrier, how can we help you help us protect our supply chain and keep our brand moving forward? That kind of uses the plan the work the plan, but also adjust kind of technique is, how do we first listen? How do we provide information to our carriers so they can know what's coming up and then what we're trying to execute? And then in this environment, continue to adjust as needed. Stay close, meaning that, all the origins right now, and we work with about 5 different origins, it's highly dynamic. It's changing week to week, month to month. More of the recent situation with COVID shutdowns, or the government are shutting down certain factories and increasing the level of criticalness to get your product on the on the water. I call it the kind of the whack-a-mole situation. Is we see something pop up, we must address it, and then we're also watching and being cognizant of the next. And the examples I can give are the Suez Canal blockage, gypsy moths, ocean storms, the winter storms in the U.S. I'm sure the LTL it was heavily impacted. Current COVID government shutdowns, such as the port of Yantian. And don't assume what's currently happening globally doesn't affect you, because any small ripple in the supply chain really can create a wave or a tsunami in the current market. So be cautious. Don't assume that what's happening in the market is not going to impact you. And then the last piece of it that I can recommend is all the things I just talked about. Is when you're building your supply chain as a shipper, is the importance of a flexible supply chain, meaning that have regular meetings with your providers have a good bench strength of providers, under BCO agreements, beneficial cargo owners, and also NVOs, and seek some flexibility within it. Don't have a rigid supply chain. Try to be nimble as we move through these times. I'm going to go ahead and now pass it back to the expert, Bill.
Well, thanks, Jared. I'm not sure if I'm the expert here, but I appreciate I appreciate the compliment. You know, you mentioned tons of stuff, which I think is really valuable. Not just optimizing, because optimizing is good all the time, but right now we're trying to protect our brands, protect our supply chains. That's a different thing. How easily events can disrupt supply chains that are already stressed. I mean, all it takes is a few weeks of freezing weather in Texas and everything is thrown out of balance once again. Being open-minded to new things. I mean, I so often deal with this. When you've done, as we have, when you've been in your job, in your business for a couple of decades, you've gotten used to doing things a certain way. It is hard to change. But I think in this case, we have to. Having everything on the table is the second side, the other side of that. Not taking things we wouldn't typically think of doing and considering them for a first time, and diversifying your ports, diversifying your carriers, your origins, your destinations, all these things, terribly important. I had a question for you in particular, Jared, and this was, on whether you could give us an example of a point where a shipper might want to yield on or need to yield on in contract negotiations, whether it's payment terms, loss or damage issues, or other areas.
Yeah, sure. I can speak to that. As a longtime negotiator of contracts, we took really each region. I think you have to look at it on a global basis and understand first what region you are negotiating. So are you negotiating a North America contract, US, Canada, Europe, and Japan? Understand those. And also, what are some of the normal things that you exclude? I would say that one of the number one items this year was, the peak season, right? And so recall in my presentation when I talked about capacity is king, right? So one of those things I really feel that is evaluate, what is your position? Are you going to accept no peak season? Are you going to be mutual? Are you going to put a cap? Those are some of the things that were actually talked about at TPM this year, and how you're going to put your strategy together. So I would say, typical ocean negotiations in the past have been, hold what you have, meaning that if you already have an exception, then basically the walls are up and that's your negotiation strategy. You need to reevaluate based upon what true north is. And in your negotiations, have those open discussions about if you're not flexible, what the risk and exposure additionally that may bring to your brand, or if you are flexible and you're willing to talk about those things, what that will add, right? And how that will protect your brand. So I think it's on an individual basis of what things and exclusions that you may have in the past, but be open-minded, have the dialogue early, and understand what exposure it may bring to your company. If you hold to yourself and that's the agreement you're going to get, you may find that you have less partners, and less partners most likely will mean less capacity and not protecting your brand.
Excellent. Jared, thank you. Let's go to Christy Knischel now.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Bill, for the intro, and I appreciate being here today. So as I mentioned, I will be talking about the intermodal space, since that is a niche that we work in. I can't echo enough what Jared just said about flexibility and networking. And one of the things I'll talk about too is obviously collaboration within our company and outside of the company as well. So I have a presentation here that I am going to share with everybody. So just give me a second. All right, can everyone see? Awesome. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was getting creative with equipment option and modes. So freight doesn't necessarily have to move in 53-foot dry containers or a single mode. We actually have dry freight that can move in reefers, for example. It's been a successful workaround for lack of capacity out of California earlier this year. I have a competitor friend of mine that I work with, and that was something that they were doing. They have some assets on the reefer side that they weren't using, and they were actually utilizing those for dry freight. So there are cases where you're able to do that. Try utilizing new containers if you can get your hands on them. Hyundai has a new crop of equipment now. So it's new equipment that's coming over from overseas. We have an agent that has actually purchased this equipment and has been able to move TOFC on the rail. And then we also have another agent that fills these equipment to get them across the country to other locations for the actual customer. So again, that's another option, but having a network and knowing that these things are out there and working with your third-party logistics provider to know what options there are for them in different areas. Also, moving freight that would be conventionally hauled in a 53 container can also go on box cars. There are limitations. And we've also used barges. So I'll give you a couple examples. We have freight that we've moved out of California where you could fit 53 container loads in a box car that we were shipping, but you're paying the price of 3 containers. If you're rail served and you have a spur, that's great. If you don't have a spur within your facility, we've also been able to bring it to a facility and transload at destination, or same thing at origin. But I would say for our company, we've done it where we pick up from a customer where there's a spur at the origin, destination gets taken to a facility where we transload into other equipment so that we can get that freight delivered. But again, customers that have spurs on destination, that would be a perfect alternative to shipping other modes as well to getting your product to you. Another option that we have that we've been able to find some opportunity this year was use smaller asset providers out there. I know we talked a little bit about on the truck side, all the new smaller trucking companies that are coming out of the woodworks. Well, there's also small companies like your APL, CMA, CGM, Matson, your steamship line companies that ship the 20s, 40s, and 45-foot boxes. And there's definitely options in certain markets, especially if your freight is moving westbound. But then we've also found these companies have moved some of those boxes in other locations they wouldn't typically move them to, maybe because of the need that they had. Obviously, each month or maybe even each week changes. So those are things that you have to talk to your provider about. And I highly recommend being able to work with multiple different companies, whether they're 3PLs or what other different companies, asset providers that are out there. I can tell you this year has probably been the biggest year where we have had probably the most customer calls come in trying to get capacity wherever they can. And that's one thing I would say a couple years ago, it was hard to get someone on the phone to even talk to. So building your network up and having other companies in that mix, because maybe what we do might work in some areas for you, but what maybe my competitor does works in other areas that I can't help you. So being able to build that network out is truly important. Another thing that I've actually just more recently looked into is the short line railroads across the country. I sit on the board of the TIA as the intermodal chair, and we're working with the Short Line Railroad Association and several short line railroads to see, well, what service offerings do they have? Yes, they work with shippers directly, but they also work with companies like us because sometimes shippers don't have the personnel to do those jobs, or nor do they want to deal with the railroads and do that work themselves. So we can also look into those as well. They have things such as intermodal ferry service, carload, boxcar transloading, and just some of them have intermodal service as well. So we're gathering that information as a company to be able to share with our customers as well. I have some tips here for shippers I wanted to go over. Obviously, shippers can work directly with the railroads utilizing their boxcar, carload products, as I just mentioned, or you can work with a 3PL to use the railroad's door-to-door products. Truck brokerages also have the opportunity to work with the rail's door-to-door products. So there's numerous advantages of working with companies like myself. or 3PLs out there. So there's a seamless process that you can rely on companies like us to move that for you, so you don't have to worry about that. I guess the key here too is to explore your options and create more relationships. Like I said, not everyone or every company is created equal. So the more companies that you can reach out to and see what their niche is, and maybe it's in certain areas within the country, or overseas, wherever it might be, but try to fit pieces of business into different companies instead of giving, a ton of business to one company, and then something like this happens and you're kind of left there not knowing where to go or what to do, and then trying to scramble to find someone to help haul your freight. Another option I have on here, I cannot reiterate enough how important it is to be a good shipper. So it is a carrier's market, as we all know, and carriers do not want to work with the problematic customers. They can and will go elsewhere. And here's how to be a good shipper. We talk about being a good shipper first. As far as we see the railroad cutting back on customers that are holding containers way too long. So that is something that we're trying to work with our customers on, and having those conversations on. You need to change the way that you've done business if you want to be able to get the capacity you need now to move your product. So being flexible is the difference really between getting your freight covered or having it sit. I can tell you, we have some facilities that we have moved in and out of that some carriers right now, no matter what you pay them, will not go in or out of. So that's definitely causing some issues, and we're trying to have those conversations with those customers that, unfortunately, there's things they have to do within their supply chain and network to make it easier for carriers to want to pick up their freight. Flexibility also includes having more open windows times, frames on pickups and deliveries, just being more flexible all around. Again, do not expect long dwell times. Turning over boxes is the #1 priority of any asset provider. They don't make money with a box sitting at any facility, obviously more than 2 days. And some customers, will use them as storage. So that's not something that you're going to want to do if you're going to want to be able to get capacity to move your freight. Most providers we have found want the live loads now with open windows and drops where containers turn every day or every other day. Again, being flexible due to all the different issues. I'm not sure if people understand that when drivers go in and out of whether it's a port or a rail ramp, there can be a lot of congestion and issues that are going on within these ramps, specific ramps in throughout the country, like LA, Chicago, Memphis. We've seen a lot of issues on the East Coast. There's been markets completely shut down. So there's things that are causing drivers not to be on time for anything. The rails are not on time. So again, trying to be flexible and working with all the different things that we're dealing with is going to make it easier to get your freight picked up and or delivered. Last one here, collaboration and solid relationships are key. Working with your 3PL provider and how they can get you capacity. Again, there's multiple companies out there that do what we do, and not all of us are the same. So making sure you're talking to your all the different providers that you have available to you is very key, and just finding where you might be able to fit in their network. And the last slide I have, tips for some 3PLs. Lean into your relationships with the railroads and or 3PLs. Schedule meetings with your reps. Make your voice heard, because, we are a voice for the customer, but as a 3PL too, you're also a voice for yourself. And that's something that I do here at my company. I have the relationships with the rails. I visit them, talk with them. And one thing I've been doing a lot of this year is trying to get my customers even on the phone with the railroads and having meetings face to face. And customers, I think, are enjoying that. They're having their voice heard, but also hearing what they need to do to improve their situation for the railroad to want to work better with them as well. And another tip too, keep lines of communication open with your peers, your competitors. One of the things that I've had great success with, and I've been doing this for a very long time, probably at least 18 years of my 24 years, is talking with my competitors and, what are you doing? What are we doing? What can we do to help each other? I've actually had situations where we were able to swap containers in different markets, giving me boxes in LA and I can give someone boxes in NorCal. just seeing where we can help each other and do those things. And if you don't have those relationships and conversations with people, you never know what could happen. And a lot of things have gotten taken care of because of those conversations. I also reach out to a lot of the carriers. I've done this for years, but even relationships with owners of companies and talking to them about the business and what can we do to better work together when maybe they don't want to go into a facility anymore, and sitting down and really having that conversation to how do we better come together with the customer and making this a win-win for all. So those were the slides I wanted to share in regards to intermodal. And I can't, express enough how important it is to really build your network, reach out to the experts like Jared said, and talk to people to see what are they doing, what's working, what's not working, because there's a lot of different options out there that, they've been out there. We didn't know that they were maybe out there before, or didn't think we could use them. Again, I know barges was on one of the slides that I talked about. I wanted to go back to that real quick, just because we were trying to move some freight from Texas to Florida at one point where you couldn't get a container on rail or even a truck on the truck brokerage side. And we came up with an option on shipping it from a barge from Texas over to Florida. So again, having those conversations, working with different companies that come up with some solutions for you, I think is very key in building your network collaboration. Thank you very much. I'll send it back to you, Bill.
Hey, thanks, Christy. I mean, again, you mentioned so many great ideas here. You really followed hard on Jared's comments about, being open-minded, trying new things, including, boxcar, for example. That's not something that I come across too much. Certainly using the transloading into different types of equipment is really interesting too. The importance of trailer turns, though, and box turns that you mentioned, that is really something that has been driven home to me this year by a lot of commentators. I had recently a conversation with a third party who mentioned that a carrier client of theirs walked away from $2 million of business because the shipper could not turn the trailers within, a modicum of time. They were being held up, a couple of days in some cases. And I've heard worse than that. So, obviously that's a big issue. One question I had from the audience too was asking about claims within transportation today. Of course, we're hearing a lot about claims for detention and demurrage. What options would you or any other panelists recommend to shippers regarding that? Where should they go?
I mean, and from my perspective, I can tell you, dealing with the railroad in particular, that's not anything that we have ever, had a claim that's been approved because of a long transit time or anything along those lines. So that's not something I think that is accepted. I will say, with that being said, though, there are customers, because of a situation where something hasn't gotten there as timely, we will go back to the provider and try to get some kind of money back for the movement, whether it's half or whatever it might be. Sometimes it's something that us as a company will, make a decision based on the situation or circumstance and try to, make that customer whole on a particular shipment. But I will say that's not something that typically, a railroad would definitely consider paying out due to congestion, transit, all those type of things, at least in my world.
I agree. That's from what I've seen. Well, with that, Christy, I'd like to go on to Scott from GEODIS.
All right. Thank you, Bill. As Bill said, I'm going to be focusing on the point of view from the 3PL, mainly on the LTL side, basically, because I've been doing that for pretty much the past 10 years. So, and really just what are we seeing in the marketplace, from our vantage point, with the LTL carriers, and then just, I've got a list of just some, some macro strategic things that, recommendations that hopefully can apply to you. And then really some, some micro things a lot of what Christy echoed. You're going to hear probably the same things, which I guess that's a good thing as far as some of the content. But it's definitely something cross modes that can apply. So this crunch, yeah, it is certainly different. So the carriers I speak to all the time, they say the same thing. They're saying, hey, we just hit our goal of X capacity, and our system can only handle Y, and we are going over that, right? And so, what are they? They're all saying the same thing. We're going to hire 500 drivers, 1,000. One I just spoke to recently, there's 1,600 drivers, right? So that's everyone's looking for these drivers. But at the end of the day, that's lofty, and we all know that's really just not going to happen, especially just in the short term. So, what are we seeing, from the LTL carriers in the face of this historic capacity crunch? So we're seeing no bidding of business. This is coming from some large and some regional carriers. And really, if they do bid, you're really seeing them being ultra selective, which makes sense, right? They're trying to curb capacity, which to me, that's a good thing. The ones I think that aren't doing that, I think, anyone who's working with LTL carriers, the ones that it's kind of, really just not done a good job at that. You're seeing their on time is just not doing very well, right? So, of course, we're seeing LTL carriers, they're shedding business at an accelerated level, either just by dropping without notice. I think everyone, most of you should be aware of kind of what happened with one of the largest LTL carriers. They said Friday, come Monday, you got to find someone else. So I don't know if that's the right way to really approach, cutting that capacity. But you got carriers, they're looking at double digit or mid-cycle increases that we're working through in response to this excess capacity. So embargoes, that's kind of a big thing from this side of the house that I don't think up until this year I've really seen as much, and I think it really started with the storms, right? So we're seeing embargoes out of Dallas, Memphis, Nashville. Of course, just because nothing was moving. And then, once that really subsided, it took the carriers a while to kind of dig out of that. And I think, a lot of people just thought, okay, we're done with that. But it really just kind of kept going where, every week I'm seeing, different carriers embargoing. Of course, Southern Cal and the kind of the hot spots that are always going to kind of be that way. But, we're seeing embargoes, outbound from certain carriers that normally we don't, just because, of course, they don't have the capacity, and they've really choked on it. Also, embargoes we're seeing, on the retail side. We've got, I think anyone who ships to Amazon, of course, once we get towards peak, they are just behind. But I guess the scary thing right now is that we're seeing multiple retailers, right, that they are just behind hundreds of trailers, and you've got carriers coming raising their hand, saying, listen, we were not going to deliver to these places because, we're tying up our equipment. And it's just, I think we're seeing more and more of that from the LTL side. And then, I think the big result from this, we're seeing on time pickup and delivery. This has been, even just really good carriers, you're seeing it, I don't want to say plummet, but there's been a marked decrease in on time, pickup and delivery, from, like I said, good carriers as well. And then of course you've got the truckload that's been spilling over in LTL. That's been kind of hurting us also. So really, I've just got some, just really recommendations. What have we done? Maybe something that can apply to, any of the listeners as far as, from really a macro level. And then, like I said, get kind of into more day to day. So really, I think the biggest thing that anyone could do, and of course, Christy mentioned this very well, and I think everyone will agree. It's just partnerships. So I cannot overuse that word too much. Our carriers, they are our lifeblood. We partner with the right carriers and, just make sure, we keep our commitment to them. One of the things I think we've accelerated, just reaching out to some, I want to say niche carriers that maybe we wouldn't have in the past, right? Because there's a lot of them out there, being in the industry for 10 years on LTL that, some of them I hear and I'm like, I've never heard of these guys. And it really, I think it takes, just going out and reaching out to those guys. I think, we've had some success. Setting up for success too, putting carriers on the right business. I think that's their core strength. Putting B2B carriers that are strong on that, the ones that are retail, we really try to match them. So I don't know if a lot of people are actually doing that, but I'm surprised that we get some new customers come in and they are single sourced, or maybe they've got one or two LTL carriers for a large piece of business, and it just something that we really look at is what can we do to introduce other long haul carriers, regional as well, that they haven't used before. So that's definitely something I would recommend, especially when I see some new potential customers come in and they're using one carrier. Obviously, if they've got a real good rate, a lot of times that's not always the case. So another good recommendation, this isn't anything new, but retail consolidation. So that is really taking freight out of the LTL carriers networks and just putting it into consolidation programs. So I know there's a lot of 3PLs that do that. We do that as well. We've got a very successful program out of our Indianapolis campus where we're consolidating from Walmart, CVS, Walgreens, Target, all these big retailers, pulling our customers together. And every time we've been taking it to our customers, they're just like, hey, this is great. We get it there on time. It's reducing fines. So just really, I think, reaching out to someone like us or, just any other 3PL that's doing that, I think I've seen more and more, again, just trying to alleviate that from the LTL guys who they're struggling on a lot of these retail deliveries. Definitely recommend taking a hard look at volume shots. I mean, LTL carriers, they don't like this. They never have, but especially now, like I mentioned earlier, you just get these anything really over 6 feet or 15,000 pounds. It's that tweener freight that the LTL carriers we're really seeing them push back on this more than ever, trying to limit rules, putting cubic capacity, all these kind of linear foot, restrictions that, I really haven't seen getting pushed as hard as they are. Again, they're trying to, create some capacity. So, some options on that, looking at multi-stop truckload, pooling. There's some customers that we are adjusting their ordering pattern, right? I know it may not be easy with certain manufacturers based on inventory, but if you can alter that and you're not having that, 15,000, 18,000 pound shot going on LTL, pulling that off of them, if you can, that really makes a difference. Another thing, recommendation, focusing on reducing out of zone shipping, right? We look at customers' DC locations all the time, and we've had them either move DCs or maybe open up the satellites, but just really, I think, identifying it and saying, listen, you're shipping across country, and sometimes our customers really just don't. They realize it, but they don't realize what the impact is. So we've really tried to focus on that. If you have a possibility of keeping it regional, if you've got multiple DCs as a shipper. And then another big thing, I see this a lot. So it's this could be maybe just a simple thing, is making sure your freight is profiled correctly and it's not getting misrepresented. So regardless if you have an FAK or not, I mean, if you put class 70 on a bill of lading and it's really class 125, I mean, the carriers, they're targeting this, right? They've got these dimensioners, and that just kind of puts a target on a shipper's back if again you're misrepresenting something, because that's just basically saying, hey, we're going to try to hit that up. And carriers obviously are very savvy now, and we've challenged our existing customers, especially new customers that may have inherited an FAK. They might say, hey, we've always been class, we've always been class 60, and it really truly isn't. So we try to educate, and again, just make sure you're not misrepresenting on the freight side. So really, I guess on a micro level, this kind of hits, this is kind of the back to basics is what I call it, right? I know, again, Christy was talking about this, but I mean, it's the flexibility. I mean, working with our warehouses, I mean, do you have a warehouse that turns the light out at 3:30? I mean, that to me is a problem, because I mean, you got LTL carriers that are going later and later because they don't have the drivers right. So, if an LTL carrier is saying, hey, I can pick up, but it's not going to be to maybe 4:30, you got to have that flexibility, I think, to either, keep someone ahead overtime, or maybe kind of do that flex scheduling, because, you know, you're shutting your warehouse down, and, you know, these guys just don't have sometimes the drivers to go and get these early pickups. So especially, you know, I've spoken to terminal managers, they're down 10, 20 drivers in certain areas. I mean, they're just trying to manage whatever they can. And, you know, that flexibility, I think on the warehouse side is huge. You know, here's another simple one too. I mean, it just, you know, making sure, I think your frontline people, they know these terminals and their operations and dispatchers. I guess this is going to a very micro level, but I'm working with, you know, my planners and supervisors all the time. I'm like, you know, you could be the difference between your freight getting picked up or not. It's really having that, I think, personal relationship, knowing that you can call a terminal instead of just sending them an email, just to make sure that you can get, you know, some of those smaller shipments picked up. Another thing too is just really getting those shipments in, I think, as early as possible, right? So, you know, EDI are calling them in, you know, getting them on the carrier's boards, because you know, you're waiting too late in the day, and I see this all the time. Like, hey, I just emailed, you know, at 3 o'clock, and I've got a shipment. Well, again, you know, with this capacity, it just, if you can get it ready, if you can communicate early, we've had big success in making sure that, you know, things aren't getting missed, or you know, really they're just getting picked up. Similar thing with the month end. You know, if you have that month end or even the holiday crunch, you know, I think we've been really successful with certain customers just saying, listen, you know, this is a big thing. You know, there's always month end, but I think now, especially when you throw a holiday in there, is, you know, try to look to ship a little bit earlier, right? Just kind of simple things, instead of just, you know, tripling or quadrupling your volume, you know, in those last kind of 2 days of the month. And if you can, right, go ahead and spread that out. And really, I think the biggest thing is just simply making sure that, you know, your freight is ready. Like it's 101 logistics, right? Make sure it's ready, make sure it's shrink wrapped, paperwork is ready, you know, that drivers don't have that extra dwell, because I mean, these carriers, they know where they can get in and out, right, without the extra hassle. And you know, like I said, it's really the simple stuff. I think that I try to reinforce with my operations team. And, you know, I would say the same thing to anyone listening. Just don't assume that, you know, these things are always the case, and really challenge your people to make sure they're really, you know, working to be that shipper of choice, right? So yeah, really in closing, you know, I think it's the little things, making sure we're, you know, getting the stuff ready, getting it out, making it presentable, you know, just making it as easy as you can on the carrier. That way they're going to pick up, you know, during this crazy capacity crunch. So with that, I'll turn it back to Bill.
Getting back to the basics, Scott, blocking and tackling. I love it. I mean, there's a lot that you said, you know, I don't want to recap all of it, but a couple of things really sprung out to me. You know, again, you mentioned the importance of turning trailers, turning boxes back as quickly as possible. You know, if you're holding on to trailers, that's stealing capacity from other shippers, actually, and it's your cost too. Problem is, quite often shippers can't help it. I mean, that example I mentioned before about the shipper that lost the carrier because it was holding on to those trailers too long. Their problem was they didn't have dock workers. They were down dock workers at all their locations. So their live loading and unloading was, you know, all out of whack. But I mean, these are questions everyone is dealing with. One of the really important things I think I wanted to stress again, you mentioned, you know, getting the right, putting carriers onto the right business, giving the right business to the right carrier. You know, even though carrier capacity is tight, I mean, there are lanes where carriers need business. It's as important, I think, to know your carrier's business as it is to know your own. So, you know, for example, if you know that your carrier needs greater density in a certain lane and you have freight that can go there, get that, you know, be flexible, move that freight to that lane, to that carrier. They'll most likely be glad for the help and you'll get that freight moved. That's what I think a lot of carriers today, they're looking for in-network freight. And whether they are truckload or less than truckload, doesn't matter. They're all looking for that. And finally, you said something that was really, really important, and that's that you can be the difference. I mean, I think too often, you know, if I put a shipper hat on, I have heard this from lots of shippers, not as many as I used to, which is good, but the driver shortage, that's a carrier problem. The carriers have to solve that. It's not my problem. Guess what? If you're a shipper, it is your problem. I mean, and at the end of the day, if we're waiting for help from the carriers, if we're waiting for help from Washington, we're not going to get much. You know, you have to go out and look at your entire network, make changes yourself, take action yourself to create capacity. And we can go back to that in the Q&A perhaps a bit more. But yeah, that's, I think, the critical thing. And thank you for mentioning that. Well, with that, we're going to go to, we have a question from Jared.
Yeah, I just think Scott and Billy make some outstanding points about, you know, how a shipper, from a shipper's perspective, the old adage was, when I'm making a bid and I'm assigning the allocation, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to assign to you. And that's the business I'm going to assign. And I expect you take it, right? Rather than having a collaborative discussion, as Scott noted, what are you looking for, carrier? What do you need out of all of the business that we're showing in our bid and that we have available? What are your strengths, right? What are you really interested in carrying for us? That needs to be the conversation in today's market, right? And so, as Scott noting and Christy noted, the large loads, assign them where they need to be, rather than trying to force your LTL carrier and adding and exasperating their situation. So as a shipper, be collaborative with your carriers. They are your partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. And yeah, I mean, you know, I'm hearing, you know, so many LTL carriers today are limiting the number of pallet positions in a trailer that they'll give to an individual customer, you know, so, you know, keep in mind, if you're trying to put that, you know, partial truckload into LTL and you're taking up 3/4 of the trailer, they have to then give up business from, you know, probably 10 other shippers. And are they going to do that? It's highly unlikely in this market. They're going to decide to drop 10 other shippers to haul the partial truckload, even if they get a better rate on that truckload than they normally would, because they'll lose more business and more revenue than they'll gain. Well, with that, let me go quickly on to Aaron from NFI.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to talk a little bit to start about historically what the trucking industry looks like from trends, right? So historically, we see the trucking industry, since deregulation, go through boom and bust cycles. And when I say boom and bust, it's from a trucking company perspective. When it's a boom, the carrier controls the market. They somewhat control pricing. Pricing typically goes up. Carriers would consider this market today a boom cycle because people need capacity and they're willing to pay for it. And then when you get into this market, right, you start to see asset-based carriers add equipment. You start to see smaller carriers come into the marketplace, like Bill mentioned earlier, the number of carriers that, you know, small, medium-sized carriers, 1 to 10 trucks that come into the market rather quickly and add capacity. And it somewhat is self-defeating as an industry, because then the tipping point becomes when capacity outpaces demand. And typically at that point, it's a bust cycle for a carrier begins, because the shipping community will then start to hold large scale RFPs and push that price back down, right? And the smaller fleets that came in during a boom cycle start to go out of business because they're inefficient, they're not getting the rates that they used to be, they pay their drivers less, and freight's inconsistent, and so they go out of business, right? And so the cycle starts all over again on its own, right? So you're seeing that boom cycle right now. But, you know, for whatever the drivers are, it's always, whether it's demand, whether it's capacity, something is always a driver behind that boom cycle. It could be weather. And we're seeing those boom and bust cycles the wavelength between them gets shorter, right? So the market's much more volatile than it was, say, 15 or 20 years ago, where the cycles would last a year or two and then it would go the other way. Today, we see it last 6 months or a year. Now, this cycle is a little bit different, right? With COVID and the number of carriers that were put out of business. You know, Bill mentioned the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. Driver schools have been closed. And frankly, the industry hasn't done a good job of attracting young drivers. So you're starting to see, and we've been talking about this forever, the driver shortage, but you're starting to see the driver pool age out, and there's just less young drivers coming into the industry. So until the industry finds a way, whether that's the shipping community or the carrier community, and hopefully together find a way to make driving a truck attractive for young people, we're going to continue to see that problem. So it's kind of like when you get into these cycles, it is somewhat contradictory. It's like, what does a shipper want, right? So a shipper, if you say, do you want lower cost or do you want better service? And frankly, the answer is probably both. But you know, it becomes, the word partnership comes up a lot during a boom cycle, right? Where a shipper says, hey, we want to partner with you. You're the right fit for our business, and you are everything to us. We're willing to pay you, until we get to a bus cycle. And then the shipper says, well, we really need to go RFP, and we push down on price, and the carrier says, I can't move it for that. It can't be profitable at these rates. And the shipping community tends to go with, we have to do what's best for our business, and they reallocate the freight to different carriers that maybe are buying the market or are just coming in at an unsustainable cost in order to gain market share. So you see the reshuffling of the deck chairs, right? And some carriers survive and some carriers don't. So I think, you know, when you talk about partnering with the right carrier, and a carrier talks about partnering with the right shipper, it's like a marriage, right? Marriages take work, and it's this long-term investment, right? Whether it's a boom cycle or a bust cycle, both parties have to be in it together, right? Because finding the right carrier, frankly, is hard, right? And from a shipper perspective, finding the right carrier, or I guess from a carrier perspective, finding the right shipper is hard, right? Because it's not like everybody fits everybody. But once you do, and service is there during a boom cycle, then invest in each other, right? Because at the end of the day, you're both going to be affected by a driver shortage. You're both going to be affected by capacity issues, whether it's up or down. And it's like the long term gets ignored during short-sighted cycles, right? So that's a way that, I guess that's a perspective that I always try to look at it from is, hey, this is a marriage and we want this to work, and we want this to work in the long term. Let's find a way to help each other get through it. So that's where, you know, you touched on the fact that the driver shortage isn't a carrier problem, especially right now. It's a customer problem. So when you think about the differences in this cycle, it somewhat is, from a shipper perspective, I'm sure it's a little bit scary in the fact that it doesn't seem to be like there's a tipping point coming where it's going to go the other way, right? So you got to find a way to find the right carrier during a boom cycle, and then work together to really find a good partnership. So, you know, driver recruiting and retention, right, is a big hot button topic for every carrier in the market today, right? Whether you're a dedicated service provider, you're an OTR carrier, you're a small mom and pop, you need drivers, right? So people have been talking about the driver shortage for 15 years, and this is it, right? Like, we're here. And for a lot of different reasons, right? I touched on some things, you know, that were pretty specific to COVID, but really it's been, hey, we can't attract drivers. And at some point, you know, the driver occupation just really became a difficult role to fill, maybe because it's unattractive to young people. It's a tough job. It's a thankless job. Shippers struggle to, build these relationships with carriers. So the job's not consistent. And really it comes down to quality of life, right? So if you're a driver, what do you want? I look at it and say, I want consistency. I want consistency in pay. I want consistency in route. What am I running? Where am I going? How can I communicate with my family when I'll be home or when I won't? Things like just the shipper experience. We talk about shipper of choice, but what's the driver experience like at your facility, right? You can talk about consistency of freight, and you can talk about like all of these things from from pay to, look, a driver will take less money to find consistency, fair pay, and good quality, like just fair treatment, right? So, the facilities is, as a shipper, what's your role in that? Well, certainly it's partnering with the carrier to help understand what the drivers want. But clearly having a facility where a driver, when they're being loaded, can, have a space to go, right? But more importantly, what's the driver experience like when he arrives at the facility? Most often, they're interacting with the least tenured, the least paid, and the most unempathetic people at the clerk counter, right? So if a driver comes in, maybe he's a little late, right? They just get treated poorly, right? So even when they're on time, whatever it is, the shipper needs to invest in that frontline experience. Train those people, right? Be courteous. If if the driver's going to have to wait, there's a way to explain that. There's a way to deliver that message. If there's long wait times, helping the driver understand, hey, we have this place for you to go, and there's a lounge, or, there's a place down the road you can go and come back in a couple of hours. Be flexible that way, right? Because most often than not, you hear these stories about drivers being told, go wait in your cab and we'll tell you when you're up, right? And that's tough, right? Just being on the open end of when am I going to be loaded, and I'm sitting here for 5, 8, 10 hours. Like, that's just not okay in today's world, right? So we have to find a way to improve that driver experience. And I think most often it comes down to the shipper investing in that experience. And frankly, it's pushing that experience onto their customer partners or vendors, right? Helping them understand, hey, this isn't just us. We're shipping into your facility or out of your facility. In order for carriers to work with us, we need this to be a good experience. So I think that that's a place that often gets missed, that really needs to be a place where a driver can feel appreciated again, like their time is valued. Because most often, I think that's a thing where, people think they're robots, right? Be on time, don't be late, and, don't cause any problems when you get here, right? And like, look, man, these are people, and they want to feel appreciated, and they want to feel like the work that they do is valued. So I think as a shipper community, we need to find a way to do that with our carrier partners. And I hear, just like what everybody on the panel has said, right? Find a way to collaborate. It's redundant, I know, but it really does come down to that. And then, as we go through the next cycle, find a way to make the partnership work. Even if it means paying a little more in a down cycle than you would, you're going to find your rates not going up as much in a boom cycle. If you just manage that relationship, invest in it, and don't be short-sighted, right? So be flexible and own it with your carrier partners. Ask them, what can we do to be part of the solution? How can we help? And that really isn't a message that we've heard over time from the shipper community. And I think that's really where the answer lies and how this all gets resolved long term.
I think that's a
Bill, I'll get back to you.
Yeah, Aaron, that's fantastic. Certainly, how do we become more driver centric, both as shippers and carriers, I think is an important question going forward. What does driver centric mean? We could spend an hour just talking about this, and I would love to, but we don't have time to, unfortunately. But I think we've heard fantastic insight from all of the panelists. I want to thank all of you for all that you've contributed here today. Certainly the shipper needing to invest in the frontline experience for the driver. This is something I think goes way beyond, like I said earlier, just handing over the restroom keys. There's got to be real thought put into it. How we think about drivers and the job they do and what that job is, I think needs to change as well if we want to get more people in the driver's seat. And, you may be seeing this directly, Aaron, but, one thing I do track a lot is, I look at the employment levels for long haul truckload and LTL, and also for general freight local, which is more regional, probably more e-commerce related freight. And while the long haul truckload and long haul LTL employment numbers tracked by BLS and the Department of Labor haven't hit their pre-pandemic highs yet, the numbers for local general freight they're above where they were before the pandemic. And that tells to me that more drivers are looking at alternatives that probably include doing a lot more delivery work and a lot more local work than long haul work, for a lot of the reasons we hear. You want to be home every night.
That's a great point. And
it's a new fight. It's a new fight for the long haul carriers.
It is a new fight for every carrier in the fact that you're competing against how supply chains have changed, right? The short haul freight and delivery drivers that don't need a CDL, right? So when you talk about the flexibility that they get for doing that final mile delivery, I'm sure we've all had an Uber driver show up and deliver a package to us, right? So when I talk about the attracting drivers, look, people are like, look, this is flexible. I can work part-time. I can do this, and I don't need to go to driver school, and I can do local deliveries, and I'll be home every night, or I'll take off when I want. And that's a challenge.
Yeah. So once again, thanks to you, Aaron, thanks to Jared, thanks to Christy, thanks to Scott. This has been a fantastic discussion. I have to bring us to a close for the workshop portion of the presentation now, but I need to introduce someone who's going to take us on to the next step and to eventually our open discussion. Katie Werner is an administrative assistant for the TLC. She manages memberships as well as registrations for all educational activities. When not at the office, Katie's true passion, though, is animals. She has 2 associates and a bachelor's degree in equine studies. She also teaches writing, does equine massage, and pet sits. And Katie, I could have used your help a little bit earlier here today, as you may have seen. But please welcome Katie.
Hi, thank you, Bill. So I'm Katie Werner, also known as Diane Schmidt, since we job share. Our email just has her name, Diane. So it's mostly me. She's just here one night a week. I just want to thank you all for attending our virtual workshop today, and thank you to all our panelists. In attendance today, we have members of the council as well as non-members. Of course, we think everyone would benefit from joining the council. So non-members, we will be emailing you a special offer to join the council. I want to make sure everyone knows that membership is for the company. So anyone in your company can receive member pricing on our educational seminars, virtual workshops, annual conference, and on our publications. Please save the date for our 47th annual conference, which is back and in person, March 21 through 23, 2022 in Orlando, Florida. As Dan mentioned, we have our fall seminars coming up next. We will be sending out a constant contact flyer with all the details and registration shortly. If you have any questions on our educational programs, membership, or any transportation questions, don't hesitate to call me here at the council, 631-549-8984. and I can get you through to someone who can help you. Now, I will turn it over to George and Brent for our cheese and crackers, questions and answers, and networking time. So please stick around. Take it away, George and Brent.
Okay, George, should I kick off? You're muted, of course.
Shoot back. There we go. Yeah. Hi.
All right, so
Wonderful.
first I wanted Bill, I know Bill has to leave. He has some family business to attend to. But Bill, thanks so much for a great job at moderating and your insights. And I also want to take this opportunity to again thank the panelists. Just the audience should know that apart from their time, these are all busy professionals, obviously. So apart from the time today, we also had an hour or so dress rehearsal earlier. Last week, we had another session. So they've got, they made a time commitment to this. That's really appreciated and helps support the council and its educational mission. Now with that, I see the boxes are coming on screen here. And I would encourage anyone that has a question for the panelists, raise your hand, just raise your hand like this. And we'll kind of look around for people with their camera on. In the meantime, I see some people coming on board here, some names I recognize. Daniel Sullivan is with us today. Dan is a noted transportation attorney. I'm glad he could join us. I'm looking for hands raised. Questions, anybody? Bill, you got a question?
Hey, not really a question. Just want to say thank you again to you and to George and TLC and to all the panelists. It was great, a great conversation and a great workshop. I want to thank all of the audience, and I hope to see everybody live next year in Orlando. Take care.
Here. All right. Thank you, Bill.
Great.
Hey, Bill, thanks. There is a question, Brent, in the Q&A.
Okay, I'll open it up.
Looks like it would be for probably Scott, maybe.
I'm not seeing it. Christy, you want to just read it for us,
Sure.
please?
It says from Lawrence Wurzel, for a non-container shipper with LTL carriers having delays to common points and even worse to remote points, should one warehouse within a state and use a state trucker? Or how do you find a very difficult truckers that go from Long Island to a specific state and that still cover that state well?
Could you reread that for us, Christy? That's a complicated
Do
question.
you want me to
Yeah.
say it? I can say it. That's me.
Sure, go ahead.
So the question was, we ship mostly LTL and, use the big carriers. A lot of them are having trouble just going almost anywhere one time these days. And then particularly we have a lot of remote customers, and that's even worse, without any warning, they just, stuff sitting there. And sometimes they turn it over when they didn't used to. So are we better off, I don't know how we would do it quickly, but finding a warehouse in a certain state where we have a lot of business and warehousing there, and find a state-only trucker. I don't know how you find those, because I've looked for years and it's very difficult to find a trucker who goes from Long Island to those points or within the state. I guess if I was warehousing there, I wouldn't need to find a trucker that goes to a particular state from Long Island, but that would be good to find too. Different truckers than the normal
I'm gonna
national
just jump
ones,
in for a minute. Larry, you're on Long Island, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, we are too.
Yeah,
Long Island is described as the appendix of New York City. And in order to get here, you have to cross two different rivers,
Yeah.
And then we have the world's longest parking lot, the expressway and things like that. A lot of motor carriers just don't want to come here. And needless to say, there are all sorts of accessorial charges and add-ons for the bridges and the tunnels and all the tolls and all that sort of stuff. So it is, and it's also a one-way shipment, because we have 6 million people on this island, and most everything is coming in and not going out. So it's a one-way load, and it's not very economical if you can't take something back. So we've had this problem for my whole lifetime, and it's got worse when they stopped having rail freight on the island. So we do have a problem. I don't know if anybody else has any bright ideas that can help him out. I've been
Well-
dealing with this for years,
Well, I
not
think
very
the-
successfully.
Maybe, maybe
freight-
one of our, maybe our carrier rep, Aaron, any comment on that?
I mean, the freight's leaving Long Island, it's just sitting somewhere else is the problem.
So
So
I
where's
think
your
that-
freight going?
We ship to every state.
Well, no doubt that
Yeah, I mean,
Long Island's a tough spot to draw capacity from because frankly, there's just not a whole lot of deliveries onto Long Island, right? So essentially you're paying for someone to come in to Long Island to pick up freight to go somewhere else, right? I'm not sure there's a remedy to that. That's just sort of the nature.
Well,
of
again,
it.
it's not the pickup that's the problem. We deal with
Yeah.
all the big truckers, they come every day, but then
Yeah.
they,
I
they
think
move
what-
it somewhere and to get it to the final destination is the problem.
Lawrence, is what you asking is that typically you would hire a trucker from origin to destination. Lawrence, is what you suggesting kind of a hybrid where you hire the long haul trucker to take it to a DC or somewhere in a destination city and then hand it off to, say, a regional carrier?
Yeah,
You-
so right now
using two carriers on one move.
well,
is-
I don't know about one move because the carriers, some of them already do that, even though they didn't used to and don't tell you they're going to do that. But so right now we have a warehouse in Reno. So we stock stuff there and then ship it out from there, mostly by ground. But so the idea might be, let's say in the summer, we have a lot of business in Wisconsin. That's the current problem. So YRC is taking it and then, it's just sitting there unknown for a week instead of being delivered in 3 days like it used to be. So am I better off, like I do in Reno in the beginning of the summer, stocking a warehouse in Wisconsin, and then I'd have to find, is there a trucker in Wisconsin that is doing well servicing the entire state, since the national guys apparently aren't.
Yeah, would any panelists like to tackle that, or is that just the situation we're in now? And
I was going to say, Scott, this is like you, man. This is LTL.
yeah, I'll jump in here real quick. So, it sounds like you've got multiple DCs, and I did hear YRC. So that's, not to say anything good or bad about certain carriers, not knowing who else you've got, but they have been struggling. They're going to be known as Yellow pretty soon, but they are downsizing. They're taking their regionals and they're trying to cut freight kind of left and right. So just knowing that, without going too much into kind of your detail, definitely, I don't know what other carriers you've got, but it sounds like, maybe getting a hold of some regional guys.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with UPS Freight or whatever, Transforce, T-Force. They have the same problem now. We used to be 2 or 3 days wherever in the Midwest, and then you call up, it's been a week. What's going on? Where's the freight? They're all, we deal with all of them. I mean, some have more problems than others. I guess YRC and T-Force, but.
Yeah. So again, I think a lot of it really has to do with how long your freight is going. Do you have any regional carriers you can look at? For example, your Sparks area, are you using some regional guys you can look at, or just regional out of the Northeast? Someone like a Pitt, Ohio, or a Pile, or a Mark IV, which
we
might
use,
do a little bit better.
Right. It's more the Midwest, and out of Reno, its shipments are mostly ground, so they're no problem. In the Midwest, it's we're using ADUI Pile, New Penn. Regionally, there's I don't think much problem with them. It's more the going to outside of the immediate area and not to the West Coast, in between.
an interesting dilemma. Now, do we have some other questions here from the audience? I noticed we have some other regular attendees here. Joe Thompson is on board today. Thank you, Joe. He's been a loyal viewer. I notice we have a couple of TLC board members here. Aaron, if I'm not mistaken, you're on the board or past member of the board. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you currently on the board now?
I am.
Okay, good. And just
John Gertz is on there too.
okay. Maybe if the board members weren't so shy, they could turn their cameras on and wave, but you don't have to. And I see Vic Henry there. Vic, I believe you're the one that asked the question about claims for delay. You'd have to unmute if you want to comment.
Yeah, I was curious about how the landscape might change on delay claims, both what claims could be made, since, you know, if things are being delayed because of what we've been talking about, you know, what are the available remedies for the shipper? And then, you know, from the, see what y'all thought about if there's some new wrinkles that might arise from the situation we're in.
Well, I could tell you, but go ahead, Christy.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, I know speaking from the intermodal side, I mean, even on the truck side, I mean, again, like the rails they produce schedules and transit times, and everything is not guaranteed. Even their guaranteed service, so to speak, is not guaranteed. And I think they do that for a reason, because of storms that happen, or, you know, natural disasters. There's things like this, you know, that come up where it's almost like, because we had this come up last year in a situation where a customer, I think, wanted to consider like that whole force majeure, you know, situation where the railroad's like, hey, we're not responsible because this happened. We have no control over shutdowns or whatever the case may be. So I know it's a very difficult situation, because even when I was out at the railroad recently with the Union Pacific, one of the things we talked about was them, again, talking about the shippers unloading and loading boxes timely and turning those boxes. But I also told them that if their transit was on time, that we wouldn't have these issues, because then sometimes the customer could take the freight the next day, but then a truck is booked up for a week or two. And so it's not just even the shipper issue too, it's also like with the railroad, them having consistent transit times. But I will say it's a situation where they put in there where it's like they're hands off. No matter what happens in those cases, it's just a situation where they're just not responsible when things like that happen. I don't know on the truck side or LTL if anything's a little bit different, even though we do some, we've never had a scenario like that come up. So
Well, I could maybe address on the truck side. I'm not a trucker, by the way, but I do a lot of negotiations with motor carriers on behalf of shippers or brokers. And oftentimes we'll start the negotiation with a contract template that the shipper has used. And what will be redlined, amongst other things, is every place the word DELAY is in that contract. It is redlined, including, like, we might have a section heading says, you know, liability for loss, damage, and delay. It's crossed out of the section heading. So
Right.
they're not going to entertain delay. And that gets us back. I'd like maybe Jared to probe a little bit more some of these issues where traditionally shippers have hung tight and said, you know, this is non-negotiable. We have to have this. Where are the things that you see that people, you know, you gave some examples generically, but, you know, like payment terms. I know some shippers ask for 120 days payment terms, 90 days, 60. I know in ocean, it's not quite the same, but where are these points that the shipper just has to say, okay, I give up. Let's not hang with that.
Well, I think you have to look at it from a, not everything's free. And from a shipper's perspective, and I've been talking to shippers for, you know, long time, is there's this sense that things are free and they're really not. And a good example of that for ocean would be all the detention and demurrage. If you're screaming for containers in Asia, why is your contract say you want 30 free days of detention? I mean, let's get real here, right? This is where the collaboration happens, and there's shippers that are still holding on to that. So like Christy was talking about is, yeah, we're getting all these containers and then people are using for storage. So you really have to make sure you're procuring the services for transport of goods. Secondly, I would add to Vic's question and to Brent is I always stress that make sure that we're picking the right mode of transport. So if we have priority product that we have committed to our partners and to our fans, we want to make sure that we're evaluating the right service and inform the others internally. We understand this is a priority. We're going to put it on a sleeper team, for example, over the road, and we're not going to put it on the rail, right? We're not going to go to our rail partner and say, how come you didn't get it to us in 7 days? And it may have, and we know that Chicago was challenging and other rail is challenging, and we've adjusted our lead times accordingly. But make sure as a shipper that you're putting time-sensitive goods, especially in this unprecedented market, on the right mode of transport.
Yet another good thought. Now I'm looking around the room for questions, or in the Christie in the Q&A box. You seeing anything?
No, it was the same one about the gentleman trying to get the freight moved out of Long Island across the country.
Okay.
And yeah, like I said, Scott said, I think the biggest thing there is making sure you're able to reach out to other regional carriers, or, maybe someone like Scott could help you out, and having those conversations with carriers as well. And really working on those partnerships and asking them why, or what could change that. I know on our LTL, there's different services you can pick too, and depending on the carrier you pick, the price you pick, the service level is going to be different as well. So when I think Aaron talked about it earlier, you have what's important, service or price. I mean, they're both important, but sometimes you got to pay more to get the service that you truly need. And at the end of the day, if you don't get the service that you need, then you look bad to your customer it just goes down the line. So those are things to just think about.
Okay, thank you. And I think what we're going to do, we're going to wrap it up here. We're going to let George close today. But before we do, I want to just make sure any of the panelists, Aaron, Scott, you have any last observations for us, or have you, or not?
There is one more question.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry. It says, does anyone have tips for procuring long haul carriers in this market as a smaller brokerage? It seems like they are all focused on really high rates and how efficient the shipper and consignee are. But if you don't price the load right, it's really easy to get yourself upside down. We primarily operate in the Northwest.
And this is a broker asking the question.
Correct.
Aaron, Scott?
I can certainly give you my perspective. It's all about partnership. I mean, not to be redundant, but you have to find consistent carrier partners as a third party, as a broker, that you work with on a consistent basis. Otherwise, you're subject to the market, right? It's a really tough time to be negotiating with carriers, especially knowing historically how these boom and bust cycles go, and the empty promises that have been made over time. Really it's tough time. So you're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place if you're trying to find those carriers right now. But in the long term, it's about developing those relationships with the right carriers over time.
Okay, well,
Good.
George, you want to give us some parting thoughts?
Well, I want to thank the panelists, and I thought it was just a delightful and very informative program, and I think you've all done a wonderful job. So thank you very much. As being a quote a legitimate old timer, every once in a while I feel like I just want to pipe in and say something. But you guys did such a good job. I avoided that, and I didn't have to. So thank you very much. Okay. And thank you all for all you attendees who are still with us. I hope that you will now give a little thought to the wonderful Transportation and Logistics Council. And the kind of things that we do, our motto, education for transportation professionals. And we suffered through the COVID thing and decided that we would learn how to do Zoom. 2 years ago, I couldn't even spell it, but now that's what we do. So, but we're going to come back and we'll be having our annual conference, and it's going to be in Orlando. And I would hope to see you live and in person next spring. Okay. So thank you.
Thank you as well.
Thank you.